Yeah, the title of my presentation is Why a Job Guarantee is Necessary and Long Overdue, and Why a Universal Basic, I've crossed out income, done that deliberately, because I guess my presentation, I'm going to argue for the job guarantee and against what most people would call a universal basic income. And one of the reasons is because, from my point of view, an income is something you earn, and what most people think of as a universal basic income is not something you earn. So it's a universal basic claim. It's a financial claim, you know, in the form that most people think of a universal so-called basic income. It's a financial claim on real goods and services that would be provided to every person. So actually, I'm going to start off by pointing out a few things before I start talking about the job guarantee and the universal basic claim. Just a few things we know. We know that the gap between rich and poor is growing, and that many people live below the poverty line. We also know, not just within Australia, but generally worldwide, that the nexus between productivity growth and real wage growth has been severed. So most of the gains in productivity are going to capital. So post-World War II, so we're talking about a 30-year period after World War II, the gains in Australia were equally shared between labour and capital. And that ceased in the early 1980s. And if I wasn't so lazy, I would have found a figure. This is by Bill Mitchell on his Billy blog. It only goes back to 1997. I'm sure Bill's got one somewhere that goes back to about 1980, which I would have preferred to have put up, because I think the year in which that gap... So the green line is hourly productivity index, and the blue line is real wage index, and they should be going up together. About 1945 to about 1983, they track each other together. And then from about 1983, they start to depart. And 1983 is a significant year because that was a new government, a Labor government, introduces the Prices and Incomes Accord, and that was the thin edge of the wedge. Bob Hawke got union leaders and businesses together, and he got the unions to say, okay, we won't press for wage rises, and businesses, you don't put up your prices. The only problem was that the Australian Constitution allows the federal government to control wages but not prices. There used to be a thing called the Prices Justification Tribunal, which was formed in 1974 by Gough Whitlam, didn't have much teeth. And then in 1983, that became the Price Surveillance Authority. And it wasn't all businesses, it was large businesses. If they wanted to put up their prices, had to lodge or submit some sort of application, which would be assessed by the Prices Surveillance Authority, and they sort of recommend whether the price rise was appropriate or not. But even if they said it wasn't, the corporations could put up their prices. It sort of worked to some extent early on, because it sort of named and shamed businesses that didn't do the right thing, but they can just ignore it. But that seemed to be the time at which this gap between the increase in productivity and real wages, the gap started to grow, which means the productivity gains are going to the owners of capital rather than to labour. And of course, the owners of capital get rich and the workers don't get as rich, and that's one of the factors explaining the growing gap between rich and poor in Australia. So CICG, I mean a currency issuing central government. So I'm talking in Australia, the Australian federal government. So the taxation of the federal government creates a demand for the government's currency. And it's needed to extinguish tax liabilities. We know that. We've got to get hold, if you owe so much in taxes to the Australian federal government, your tax liabilities are denominated in Australian dollars, you've got to get hold of Australian dollars. And the only issuer of base money, which sits at the top of the money pyramid in Australia, is the only entity that can create that and provide that is the Australian federal government. So we've got to get hold of the stuff. So how can we get hold of the stuff? Well, we can offer our labour to the federal government. And if they employ us, they give us its currency, which we can then use to pay our taxes. Or we can produce goods and services. So we work for ourselves, we produce goods and services, and we sell them to the federal government to get the money. Or we sell it to someone else who's managed perhaps to work for the federal government and got the currency that way, so we get it indirectly. Or we work for someone else who produces goods and services, who sells them to the government and gets the money that way. Either way, taxes raise the spectre of unemployment, which occurs if we can't obtain the paid work we desire. So we desire paid work because we need to get the money to pay our taxes. And if we can't get that, then we become unemployed. So it's the need to get paid work to pay your taxes, which creates the possibility of unemployment. Now, the government can deal with that. It can make sure that it's spending enough so we do work, get the desired hours of work so we can pay our taxes. But they don't do that anymore. They used to do it, but they don't do it. So unemployment occurs when total spending is less than the full employment level of GDP. So forget about retraining it and what have you, and health, education outcomes are important in terms of the productive capacity of the economy, but they don't employ people. Okay, they might make a person better able to do a particular job, but unless the job's there, they don't get the work. Now, it's important, I've underlined there that that's at the prevailing distribution of income. That is important, and I think even some MMT people forget this, because quite often it's argued that if there's unemployment, there's only one real way to deal with it, and there's got to be more spending. Well, you can have full employment with any level of GDP. In the 30 years following World War II, full employment was basically the norm in Australia. Full employment hasn't existed in Australia since 1974. So the Australian federal government, as a currency issuing central government, has no fiscal constraint, so it can mobilise any idle resource, including unemployed labour, to ensure full employment. So since 1974, the federal government's failed to net spend, given the distribution of income at any point in time since 1974, has failed to net spend to the level required to achieve and maintain full employment. So unemployment's been a political choice. You haven't had to have it. You could have had full employment since 1974. Now, you might dispute this next point, but I think this is a key point when we're comparing the job guarantee to universal basic claim. The main reason why I'm calling it universal basic claim is that the public has a disdain for people receiving a financial claim on goods and services they haven't earned. Whether it's someone on the dole, or it's a wealthy person getting paid, or someone, I guess it's payment. The couple of people who own that bit of land out Western Sydney, it was worth $3 million, not $30 million for the new airport. People have disdain for that, and you could argue that they earned the money to buy that piece of land, which is now worth $3 million, but to get $30 million, they really got something they didn't earn. So people have disdain for that. The job guarantee wage is earned. In order to get it, you have to work. When you walk through a job guarantee office, you get paid a minimum income, but you've got to work for it. With the universal basic claim, it's not earned. So if income is an earned claim, as I think it should be, the universal basic claim is not an income. That's why I call it universal basic claim rather than universal basic income. Unemployment is disastrous. The unemployed and their close connections, generally family. It leads to social inclusion, stigmatisation, loss of self-esteem. It's a major contributor to mental illness, homelessness and various forms of abuse to oneself, suicide, the worst of it, and to others perpetrated by the unemployed, family abuse, child abuse, whatever. A lot of it can be linked to problems where the origins come from long periods of sustained unemployment. People value work. We don't live in the era of satanic mills. Not all work's irksome, and people do value it. So yeah, it gives them a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of contributing towards society goals. There's no doubt that unemployment has huge implications for people's physical and mental health. So the idea that if I could just pay you and you didn't have to work for the rest of your life, that person might be quite happy for a year or two, but eventually, yeah. So there is value in work. That's what basically the main point. Yeah, but it's the mainstream economic view is that work is something we don't like, and we only do it to get the income to buy the goods and services that offset the irksome nature of work. But people do value work, and that's important, and particularly when you're comparing job guarantee with universal basic claim, because the universal basic claim sort of assumes that someone who's currently unemployed, who's perhaps on the, I don't know, what's the dial worth, $15,000, $20,000? If you, let's say the universal basic claim was $40,000, that they'd be happy just on the $40,000, just smoking pot or whatever, that they're playing their video games still. And their mental illness would disappear, and that's just nonsense.
And the price of dope would go up.
Right. A currency issuing central government must run budget deficits for the non-government sector to run surpluses. I've sort of said that anyway. A stable financial system requires the non-government sector to possess healthy quantities of net financial assets. So we need money stored away. Okay, so we don't have to, if we want to maintain healthy spending levels, whatever that might be, we don't have to be borrowing all the time. Because then we get up to eyeballs in debt, and then at some point we say, oh, we can't service these debts, so we stop spending. And that's what sets off things like the global financial crisis. A stable financial system requires the private sector to be running surpluses and accumulating net financial assets. The mob that's got to be doing the deficits is the mob that can do it on a sustainable basis, and that's the Australian federal government. So we saw 2007, after the federal government was running the surpluses for about 10 out of 11 years, and it was the private sector running the deficits, we got to eyeballs in debt, because when we're running deficits, we're spending more than we're earning. And you can only do that if we borrow. So, private sector debt went through, household debt as a percentage of GDP went through the roof. And, it wasn't the subprime mortgage crisis in the USA that caused... that wasn't the root cause of the global financial crisis. It might have been the trigger, might have been the straw, those sorts of things, the straw that broke the camel's back, but that wasn't. It was private sector debt. So the likes of Peter Costello, he probably still doesn't recognise that all those budget surpluses that he and other treasurers around the world were running was one of the main reasons for the global financial crisis. So therefore a stable financial system. So if the private sector's got to run surpluses, that means that the currency issuing central government has to run deficits most of the time. It doesn't have to be running them all the time, but most of the time. And that's the way it used to be. Even with conservative governments, 1949 to 1972, 23 years of conservative government, 17 years of those under Bob Menzies. Most of those years, Steve probably knows, he doesn't want to say anything. Out of those 23 years, it was probably only about 2 of those where the federal government ran a surplus. The other 21, they ran deficits, and quite large deficits. A bit about inflation, and you can define these things a little bit differently than the way I have here. And I think this becomes important when I talk about the inflationary effects of, in particular, of the universal basic claim. I'm also going to talk about potential inflationary effects of the job guarantee. So it's not as clear cut that a job guarantee ensures full employment and no inflationary pressure. It's not quite as simple as that, and I'll talk a little bit about, but it's nowhere near anything like you would get with a universal, if you introduce a universal basic claim. So cost push inflation occurs when there's a sudden rise in the cost of production. That initially leads to price increases. So the cost of production goes up. Good example was the oil price shock of 1973. If the global economy ran on oil, so the cost of production went up. Businesses marked up above the cost of production, so up went prices. And then what did workers do? They responded by saying, I want a wage rise. How do businesses react to that? They put their prices up, and it creates a wage price spiral. So it's a wage price spiral, but it's triggered by an initial price increase caused by an increase in the cost of production due to some important input factor of production, the cost of it going up, spiking, going up quite dramatically. Yeah, so wages and prices continually push each other upwards. Demand pull inflation occurs when prices continue to rise due to total spending, that's aggregate demand, continually exceeding the productive capacity economy, which is the maximum aggregate supply. So if the demand for stuff, real stuff, continues to exceed what the economy can supply, that also can cause, and that in fact that can trigger a wage price spiral as well. So even if the spending exceeds it, and then say the government or something happens and spending comes back, that can trigger a wage price spiral as well. So demand pull then becomes something more like a cost push type of situation. But most inflation is of the cost push variety. Demand pull inflation is very, very rare. I mean, basically, to have it, you've got to have full employment. For spending, demand to exceed the productive capacity economy, it means that all resources are fully employed. Well, we haven't had full employment since 1974, so that means we haven't had demand pull inflation in Australia since 1974. So all inflation has been of the cost push variety. So demand pull inflation has probably not occurred in Australia since 1974, although it could happen overnight because most countries are using resources at a greater rate than the environment can sustain the supply of those resources, and if those countries limited their use of resources to the maximum sustainable rate, then natural resources rather than labour would be the limiting factor of production, and demand would far exceed what the economies could supply, and it would immediately trigger demand pull inflation in some countries. In Australia, it depends. According to the Global Footprint Network, Australia's footprint is less than its biocapacity. I only go by what they say, but a country like the USA, it's 2.25 times its biocapacity, which would mean that for the USA to be at the ecological limit, it would have to reduce the rate at which it uses resources to about 45% of its current rate, which means everything else held constant, its productive capacity would be 45% what it currently is. China's got a footprint greater than its biocapacity, so similar again. Most countries do because globally the ecological footprint is 1.7 times, might have come back to about 1.6 because of this COVID-19, but still. Well, and that's a very conservative estimate. So, if globally ecological footprint exceeds biocapacity, it means that even though there are some countries that might have a footprint less than their biocapacity overall, there are more countries with a footprint greater than biocapacity. So there's not much in the way of demand pull inflation around the world, but that's only because a lot of countries are using resources at a rate greater than the natural environment can sustain them, and market prices don't reflect that. So it's not, because if they were, you could argue then there ought to be cost push inflation now. I've just put, I put this in this morning. High interest rates don't put downward pressure on prices. In fact, I believe they do the opposite. There's a long-running debate amongst ecological economists as to whether or not interest rates compel the GDP to grow, and Steve has now convinced me. I think he's sort of done it. I've sort of done it myself to some extent, but Steve's helped. Interest rates have virtually no impact, in my opinion, on spending levels. So the government, the Reserve Bank, for whatever reason, increased interest rates to 10 or 15%, and all of a sudden, the cost of borrowing to run your business when you borrowed for capital investment purposes and what have you went up. What are you going to do? Well, what we know is that the sort of mainstream view that most industries are perfectly competitive and that all firms are price takers is nonsense. They're price setters. So your cost of borrowing goes up. So what do? You put up your prices. You just pass it on. High interest rates have, in my opinion, contribute to cost push inflation. So we don't have as much cost push inflation because we've got low interest rates. It's one of the, in my opinion, it's one of the factors. It's not the be-all and end-all, but I think low interest rates, in fact, help keep inflation down. And Japan's had virtually close to 0% interest rates for umpteen years, and I think there's no coincidence that it also has a low rate of inflation. More to demonstrate a point more than anything else, the universal basic claim. This was about June this year. It was 25.6 million Australians. I was surprised how many adult Australians there were relative to minors. 19.8 Australian adults. So we are getting old. I thought there'd be a bit more minors. So with minors, I'm talking about under 18. Yeah. 5.8 million minors. Okay, if we're going to have a universal basic claim, so it's got to provide the basic necessities and probably a little bit more to be of any use. Let's say it's set at $40,000 per year, at about close to 20 million, that's got to go to every adult Australian, 20 million, close to 20 million adults, that's 800 billion per year. Now that's going to replace a lot of welfare payments. So if you're on a pension, you don't get the pension anymore, you get the universal basic claim. So I've worked out it might replace around about $200 billion of current welfare payments. So in net terms, if a universal basic claim was given to everyone at about $40,000 a year, that is about $600 billion. June 2020, GDP was around about 2 trillion. So that's $2,000 billion. That's Australia's GDP. Full employment level of GDP, full capacity, was approximately 2.4 trillion. So there's spare productive capacity of about 400 billion. Right, we've got the capacity to produce 2.4 trillion, but we're only producing 2. And that's reflected in unemployment and underemployment. So assume the expenditure multiplier. Now I won't go, for every dollar that is injected and spent into the economy, that money spent becomes someone's income and they spend some of it, which becomes someone's income and they spend it. But because some of that extra income is saved, the bit extra that's spent gets smaller each time and eventually it goes to zero. But after that entire process, the amount of income that's generated from the initial increase in spending will be a multiple of that initial spending. If the expenditure multiplier is 2, it means that if someone's borrowed $1 from a bank and spent it into the economy, GDP will go up by $2. There'll be another dollar that will have been of income that will be generated. So let's assume the expenditure multiplier is 2. So if there's $200 billion of additional spending due to financial injections times 2, that's 400 billion. That takes up the spare capacity. All right. Well, the UBC, therefore, given in net terms as 600 billion, would constitute around about 400 billion of potential additional spending above the initial increase required to reach full capacity. That's 600 billion minus the 200 billion. The whole idea of the universal basic claim income is that it's to provide not just something, it's to provide the minimum required for people to live a reasonable existence. And I would say that would have to be, in today's money terms, about $40,000 a year. And of course, being universal, it's got to go to everyone. It goes to everyone. The richest person in Australia, the poorest. We needed spending to go up to 2.4 trillion to reach full capacity, and it's gone, and there's potential for 400 billion more spending than that. It's going to be hyperinflationary. Why? Because the new claim on goods and services would not be matched by a concomitant increase in goods and services for sale. Why? And this is one of the biggest problems of people who are all for a UBC, is they, for some reason, imagine that these goods and services that we're going to claim are just going to fall from the sky. And they're not going to fall from the sky. They require the employment of people to be produced, every one of them. Now, even if it's a minor amount of labour involved, basically, labour is involved in the production of everything that forms part of the GDP. So the introduction of the UBC would result in perhaps $400 billion of potential excess spending. The government would need to tax 50% of the UBC, a way to prevent hyperinflation. I mean, I know I'm just playing around with numbers. So yeah, everyone gets 40 grand, and after the government taxes everyone, to stop hyperinflation, we end up with 20,000. So yeah, it's no longer a basic income claim. So yeah, UBC recipients would be left with $20,000 per year. So it would no longer be a living claim on goods and services. That's assuming there's no withdrawal of labour. Why might there be some withdrawal of labour? Okay, let's look individual pre-UBC. Let's say their after-tax income is $80,000 a year. Individual post-UBC, they would receive 40,000 UBC and they still go to work and get 80,000 bucks. So they're 120,000 now. Now some people might still go to work and get the extra 80,000 on top of the 40,000 to get 120,000. But a lot of people might do what this person is thinking about doing. The individual decides they'd prefer additional leisure or non-work rather than additional claim on goods and services, so they work to the extent needed to maintain an $80,000 annual claim on goods and services. So they receive the 40,000 UBC, after-tax income of 40,000 per year, so a person withdraws half their labour. Total claim on goods and services, 80,000 per year for half of previous work contribution. But anyway, the full employment level of GDP would shrink. It's no longer at 2.4, it could be at 2 trillion. That would mean that the entire 800 billion UBC would be potential excess spending. It means that the government would have to confiscate the whole lot to prevent hyperinflation, the lot. So you get nothing. What about job guarantee? All right, June 2020, GDP 2 trillion. Full employment level of GDP is 2.4 trillion. Now, it's a bit low with the GDP, with the job guarantee, because those unemployed, some of those unemployed people, they're going to be paid at the minimum wage. So that extra 400 billion of spare capacity, that was people on various wages, some well above $40,000. These are just people on 40,000. So the extra amount of spending, level of spending to fully employ people who are unemployed at $2 trillion only takes GDP up to 2.2 trillion. So you need to increase GDP by 200 billion to achieve full employment. Of course, that can be achieved with a job guarantee, because you just walk into a job guarantee office if you can't get a job in the private sector or conventional public sector, and you've got a job at $40,000 a year. Assume expenditure multipliers 2, job guarantee wage 40,000 a year. You need to increase spending via financial injection equal to 100 billion times the 2. So that's the difference between the 2.2 trillion and the 2 trillion to get, so you only need 100, and that's about what it would be, 100 billion. If you put all unemployed people to work at around about $40,000 a year. So assume job guarantee would constitute approximately 100 billion of additional net spending, because you get the full employment because that flows on with additional spending because of the multiplier effect. So in fact, not everyone who is currently unemployed would be employed on the job guarantee. Some would actually be employed within the private sector as those people start spending. No spending above the full employment level of GDP, so no need for further taxes. So there's no need for taxation, further taxation, as there is with the UBC. Okay, now there is still a potential problem, because I'm sort of assuming that what is produced by the job guarantee employees is available for sale. See, they get paid, people who are employed on the job guarantee, and then they spend it on goods and services for sale. It's only not going to be inflationary if the stuff that the job guarantee people are producing is part of that stuff that is for sale. If it's not being added, it's just being provided by government free of charge, then there's going to be extra spending for the same quantity of goods and services available for sale. So it's still potentially inflationary, job guarantee. So it potentially exists for total spending exceed full employment level by a small amount, may need a minimal increase in taxes. Could simply raise the marginal tax rate of the rich. Only slight increase would be needed to quell inflation with effective job guarantee, should there be such. So if we needed to do a bit of tax, let's just tax the rich. And that would help further reduce the gap between rich and poor. Now, you could say, OK, if you're a big fan of the UBC, why don't we just do that with the UBC? You said, Phil, you've got to do a lot of taxing, just tax the rich. Yes, but the magnitude of tax increase, you have to tax a lot more, would be considerably greater and would almost certainly extend to people on middle incomes. The extra spending beyond what takes you to the productive capacity is far greater with a UBC than it is with a job guarantee. So you've got to confiscate more, and it's more because the 40,000 goes to everyone. With a job guarantee, it only goes to people on the job guarantee. The way I'd do it is I'd have the minimum income is 40,000, and I'd have that as the tax-free threshold. So even if you work and you earn 40,000, so you're on a minimum income in the private sector, and let's say that's you wouldn't have to pay any tax. Pension would be at 40,000, disability, all sorts of pensions. Yeah, everything would be at 40,000. Worse still with the UBC, tightness in the labour market could lead to a wage bidding war between private and public sectors to attract labour, since a lot of the previously unemployed people, so you canned everyone out of UBC. Remember, we're below productive capacity. Now, that'll be spent, and that'll stimulate spending, and a lot of people will become employed. In fact, you might get full employment out of it. But those people won't be paid the 40 grand. Some of them will be getting paid 100, 120,000 and what have you. This would add cost-push inflationary pressure to already existing demand-pull inflationary pressure, because you're going to have the potential for a wage bidding war between the private sector and the public sector. And this wouldn't happen. Now, I'm not saying it wouldn't happen with the job guarantee, but it wouldn't happen to the same extent, because the previously unemployed are paid a minimum wage which serves as a wage floor. So the private sector won't have to offer wages to draw people away from the job guarantee if private sector economic activity picks up. The gap between award wages and the minimum wage already performs that function. So if private sector economic activity is weak and a lot of people are employed in the job guarantee, and then it picks up and businesses want to rehire people, and they would normally hire someone to do this particular job for $80,000, that's their award wage. They don't have to offer them $90,000 to drag them away from the job guarantee, because they're only getting paid 40 grand. But if this person had got employment because the universal basic income at around 80 or whatever, then you have the potential for wage bidding wars to drive wages up, which of course drives up prices and so forth. So here's my table. Job guarantee versus universal basic claim, desired feature. So I've got, 9 or 10 there. Currency issuing central government can afford it. Well, they both get a tick. Currency issuing central government can afford anything. But that's the only tick that universal basic claim gets as far as I'm concerned. Second one, constitutes an income, has been earned by a recipient, likely accepted by public. Job guarantee, yes. I'd say universal basic claim, no. Guarantees desired hours of work for recipient, which of course we know is important. You know, the disastrous effects, physical and mental health effects of unemployment, that's guaranteed. That's the desired hours of work for the recipient. You walk through a job guarantee office, even if you only want 20 hours of work, you get 20 hours. No guarantee of that with a universal basic claim. Deals with mental illness and social exclusion issues related to unemployment. Job guarantee, well, obviously, deals with that to some extent. It doesn't solve it. Now, if someone's got a problem, they may need some help, but it certainly helps to deal with the cause of the problem, so perhaps fewer people in the future suffer from mental illness. But that's not going to be the case with the universal basic claim. There's no guarantee that a person's going to get work. So, yeah, someone with the mental illness is currently on the dole $15,000, $20,000 a year or whatever it is. If they're just doing the same thing but you give them $40,000, that's not going to solve their mental illness problem, I'm sure. Might even exacerbate it. I don't know. They might, they can buy more drugs. Yeah, but the best therapy is work. It is. It's. There is overwhelming evidence to suggest that the great majority of people who are suffering from a mental illness have had a long period of unemployment. So if that's the case, then one of the ways you can help avoid some of these mental illnesses is to make sure people don't get unemployed in the first place. You don't guarantee that with a universal basic claim, you do with a job guarantee. Even if that's complicated, that's damn sight better than them currently sitting on their lounge room sofa, unemployed on $15,000, $20,000 a year, abusing themselves. So, for all the complications there are, it's never going to be simple. It's not going to be smooth and easy. It's so much, and a universal basic income's claim is not going to help one little bit.
Would it, JG, be optional or would it be compulsory?
No, so you don't have to do it. But so, yeah, I must admit, I didn't put that on the slide. So you would still have something like the dole. You'd get about $15,000, $20,000 a year. So if you don't want to participate in it, you've got to give people something. But I don't think many people would accept the $15,000, $20,000. I reckon you got a group of 4 or 5 in a disadvantaged suburb, and one fella takes up the job guarantee, and then next week he drives past in his, it might not be a brand new flash car, but it's an updated car, and he's got a girlfriend. They go, oh, yeah, and they all go to work. Yeah. They all say, I want a bit of this. Yeah. It would break up the peer group sort of pressure that entrenches people within, in unemployment and so forth. So it provides, guarantees a minimum living claim on goods and services for sale. Yes, the universal basic claim doesn't. You get 40 grand, but you could have 20,000 of it taxed away. You could have the whole lot taxed away. There won't be a cent of it taxed away with a job guarantee. Provides a wage floor to minimise inflationary wage bidding war with private sector. Yes, job guarantee does it, but the universal basic claim doesn't. Improves equity, guarantees a minimum. Yes, because you keep your 40 grand if you're on a job guarantee. You get 40 to start with a universal basic claim, but you might not end up with it. A narrows gap between rich and poor. Yes, so even with a universal basic claim, you get 40 and then you only end up with 20. Well, if that's what the dole is, they're where they are at present, and Gina Reinhard gets $20,000 extra bucks. Generates new goods and services to match the increased claim on goods and services. Now, there's a question mark with the job guarantee because the stuff's provided by government, and a lot of that stuff might not be provided for sale. It might be just provided free of charge. So you've bit of an issue there, but certainly the government could sell some of it and probably would sell some of it, but with the universal basic claim, that's not going to be the case at all. Let me just finish and prevents the need for increased taxation to quell demand pull inflationary pressures. Well, there is the potential that you have to, for inflationary pressure, that might have to be quelled by some taxation with a job guarantee. It's not going to be a nice, easy, smooth ride, but it's going to be, that may or may not be the case, but whatever it is, it's going to be less than the taxation required in the case of the universal basic claim. It's not the people who advocate a job guarantee are saying, oh, it would be just nice and easy, no problems, no teething problems or whatever. They recognise it, but they keep it nice and simple. But I want to just talk about a few little things and put forward some sort of proposal. Okay, it's just an idea. Because it's going to be a little bit messy regardless. The job guarantee, if it was introduced, but the system's already messy. But what the job guarantee is not, the job guarantee is not a job creation program in the sense of creating permanent jobs requiring people with particular qualifications to perform such jobs. Right? It's not designed to be a job creation program. And I think a lot of people fall in the trap of thinking, oh, there's all this unemployment, well, we can create these jobs and these people will permanently exist on these jobs, and to do that job they need this qualification and they'll be paid a minimum wage. No, that's not designed to do that. Yes, yeah, that's it, that's what it is. So any permanent jobs that require qualifications, they don't belong to the job guarantee. They should be, if they're essential jobs, okay, they belong to the conventional public sector. People getting paid award wages. So I've come up with this idea, 3-tiered system. It's just an idea. I'm just thinking about these ideas at present. The tier 1 of this conventional public sector, and this is the federal government. So this would be financed and run by the federal government. And that's the base level of public goods predicated on what ought to and is promised to be provided by the federal government. That's basically what we've got now. All the public goods provided by the federal government, where they employ people to help provide them, that would be tier 1. People employed in this subsector are paid conventional award wages. Payment of conventional award wages in tier 1 poses no risk of wage bidding war with the private sector. Well, it's not doing it now, so why would it be? People recruited into tier 1 via conventional recruiting process, advert, application, interview. Have anyone seen an aggregate demand, aggregate supply sort of? Okay. The black line is aggregate supply, and on the horizontal axis, you've got GDP, and then you've got the inflation rate up on the vertical axis. And the level of GDP you get is where the aggregate demand curve intersects with the aggregate supply curve. Now, aggregate supply curve, now, it depends what school of thought you believe in. This is not the mainstream view. This is more the post-Keynesian type view, which I think is more a reflection of reality. So GDP can go up, okay, without the inflation rate going up, but then it starts to slope upwards. And where it starts to float upwards, the reason for that is because you start getting into a situation where either those people who are still yet to be employed are poorly educated, or they don't have qualifications, or if they do have qualifications, it's in the wrong area. So you have labour, supply, demand mismatches, which means when you employ these people, they're not as productive as the per hour of work as the people you've already employed. And if you're paying them the same wage, it means that the average cost goes up. So that's why it starts to, because the aggregate supply is just markup above average cost. So the average it is horizontal, and then it starts to go up when you get a bit of tightness in the labour market. And that level of GDP, that's the NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. So if GDP is very low and you've got a high rate of unemployment and you increase GDP, unemployment goes down, there's no rise in inflation until you hit that NAIRU, which is where you've got 5% unemployment. And if you reduce it below 5%, you get tightness in the labour market, labour demand supply mismatches, cost of production goes up, firms put their price up, you start to get inflationary pressure. Now, the thing about the current approach to controlling inflation is it's this NAIRU approach. So the government doesn't like unemployment going below 5% because it has an inflation first policy. So it likes GDP to be high enough and unemployment to be low enough so it goes down to the NAIRU, but don't like it to go any lower because that triggers inflation. But of course that leaves a sacrificial pool of unemployed people to serve the rest of the community in controlling. Well, you don't need that, as I'll soon show. Anyway, the tier one would be, so that's private sector plus tier one. Let's say it's 90% of people employed would be in the private sector plus the conventional, so tier one room is the conventional public sector. Then you've got this bit, and that we'll just assume that that's currently at an unemployment rate of 10%. So I'm ignoring underemployment or rolling them all together and just saying that's about a 10% unemployment rate, all right? And the NAIRU's at 5%. Well, my tier two, which is a floating subsector, the federal government hires unemployed people residing between the existing unemployment rate and the NAIRU. And this subsector would provide standard public goods. It's an opportunity to provide public goods over and above the base level while private activity is weak. So this is more than the public goods that we actually desire, but it's better to be producing, there's still a value. So the conventional public sector provides the stuff that we demand, that's what we want. You government, you've got in power. Now, I said something, I think I might have used the word promise. Well, we had in the past a Prime Minister say after he got elected that we're not providing this because it's a non-core promise, but we'll assume that the government's going to keep its promise. And it's promised to provide this level of public goods, and they've won the election based on that the conventional public sector provides that. This would be public goods over and above that.
So it could be like pandemic preparation or something.
Yeah, it could be all sorts of which things that have benefit. Yeah. But things that we're willing to forego if the private sector picks up. So these people will unemployed people will go into this tier, but if the private sector picks up, they'll go out of it back into the private sector. All right, we're not going to compromise to tier one because that's the base level of public. This is just extra. Yeah. You know, if we've got these resources available and they're not going to be employed to produce stuff in the private sector, why not employ it in the public and provide a few, but the extra benefits might not be big. They may, but at least it's some. It's not zero. So you'd say it would be worthless if there was no extra, but there is some benefit. Okay. Like tier one, people recruited into tier two via conventional recruiting process. So if you're unemployed, you walk into, what was it called? The Commonwealth Employments, yeah. So you don't necessarily get a job. Now, the reason why this is important is because let's imagine that aggregate demand was such that we've got the 10%. And all we do is soak up all unemployed people using the job guarantee. Those people would be paid $40,000. Now, why should we be paying those people between the 10 and the 5% minimum wages when we could pay them conventional award wages without it creating inflation. So the job guarantee should not be there to soak up all unemployed people. In my opinion, it should only soak up the people between the NAIRU and the full employment level. If you walk into, and the current unemployment rate is 10%, and the NAIRU is 5%, you will probably be competing with these people for a job in Tier 2. And if you miss out on that, okay, you end up with a job guarantee job. So you could be not on 40 grand, you might be on 100,000. Tier 3 is going to be the job guarantee, all right? So you can see how with the Tier 2, aggregate demand has shifted to the right, so there's extra spending. So that's private sector plus Tier 1, now the extra spending in Tier 2. And we've still got unemployment, haven't we? We've still got that between 5 and 1%, between the NAIRU and the... Now, the 1% is because that's frictional unemployment. That's just people going in and out of work. So, full employment is there's still some positive. Okay, now this is where it's a little bit controversial because it's a floating sector. Now, it's very easy as people become unemployed in the private sector to walk into the CES, apply for a job and get a Tier 2 job. So the government does the extra spending to put those people into work at conventional award wages. Now, what happens when private sector activity goes up? We want those people in Tier 2 to move back into the private sector or conventional public, the Tier 1. Now, the only way you can really do that without a wage bidding war is it means you have to employ the people in Tier 2 at slightly below award wages. So if someone doing a particular job would normally, in private sector or conventional public sector, which is $90,000, that's you would pay them that, say, 85 in Tier 2. Now remember, you might say, well, why shouldn't they get 90 grand? Well, it's better than being unemployed. That's how it is. You end up with 20,000 on the dole, and it's better than 40,000 on a job guarantee. But it would mean that if things picked up in the private sector, there would more than likely be a movement of people back out. So it's easy for the government to say when there's increase in unemployment due to a decline in private sector activity, we'll spend more. So that's easy to fill that up, that gap. But when it works the other way, there's nothing to really... Well, there is. The private sector's got to offer to pay workers more to attract them back, but that can create cost-push inflation. So you need some gap. It might be $5,000. That's, I think, you might say a lot of what that's probably the most controversial part of this, I think, because it means that you could be doing the same job as someone else in the conventional public sector who's on 90 grand and you're on 85 grand. I'll go to level 3. With the Tier 3, that's the job guarantee. That pushes the aggregate demand curve further to the right. Now, you might say, why doesn't that create inflation? Because see where it intersects now with this upward sloping bit here? But remember that the cost only went up because these people are less productive and we were assuming they were getting paid the same wage. But they're not. They're getting paid the minimum wage. So they're getting paid the minimum and they're not as productive. So it flattens out this aggregate supply curve. So the aggregate supply curve, instead of being like that, goes like that. So you get your full employment without creating inflation. Now, the ideal situation would be, let me just go to the last slide. You'd get something like this. What you really want to do is you want to educate and train people in such a way that you eliminate this without having to offer a minimum wage. So you want to, in fact, reduce the NAIRU as much as possible towards the 1% frictional unemployment rate, which I believe we had in the 1950s and 60s. There was no job guarantee in the 1950s and 60s. We had basically full employment. We didn't have hyperinflation. How did we have it? Basically, we had our education and training institutions, and we had an apprenticeship system where people who knew, I need this person in the future, they trained them so they were job ready. So it was a better matching of labour demand and labour supply, which meant you shrunk this NAIRU so that in actual fact, because if you can get the NAIRU down to where you've got frictional unemployment, you don't need a job guarantee at all. If there is unemployment, someone walks into the CES, they get paid and employed in Tier 2. They don't get the minimum wage, they get a Tier 2 wage. You'll get, say, something like this, private sector Tier 1, 93%, Tier 2, 6%, frictional, no job guarantee at all, no need for it all. And not only that, you get the full employment level of GDP shifts to the right. So this aggregate supply curve shifts to the right because the people that you are employing, this last are more productive. They're more productive. So that's it. It's an idea. And